Hello, everyone. Welcome to CripChat. You're already
Oh, God.
Hey,
So, is that
everyone.
Jonathan?
Hello.
And welcome to special guest, Megan. How are you, Megan?
I'm pretty good, Ibby. Thank you. Great to be here.
It's great to have you back on our show. Today we'll be talking about airport accessibility and disability accessibility in aviation. I think why paper. So is that Jonathan?
In aviation airport.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for the clarification, Jonathan. In aviation airport. So before we do get started, Megan, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Megan Spindler-Smith. I am the Deputy CEO of People with Disability Australia, which is a peak body. It is the peak body for people with disability throughout Australia. And we also happen to be, driving change around how we ensure that policies and the inclusion of people with disability in society are being done in a way that is disability affirming. And I'm lucky enough to be here with Mitchell Skipsey, and I'm sure that he would love to introduce himself.
Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Mitchell Skipsey, and I'm a senior solicitor at the Justice and Equity Centre. We're a social justice law and policy centre, and my work in particular is within what's called our strategic litigation team. So that basically involves us using a variety of legal tools to try and achieve systemic outcomes. And particularly the work I do is around disability rights. So that includes work on the NDIS, but also particularly for today's discussion around disability discrimination and accessibility rights. So that includes bringing legal cases. It sometimes includes talking about those cases or pushing for reforms to the law and government practices to make sure that people all have an equal right to do things like fly safely and in a way that sort of respects their rights and dignity.
Cool. Thank you for that, Megan, and thank you, Mitchell. And welcome to your CripChat. To get things started, what are some of the most significant barriers people with disabilities face when traveling through airports?
So Megan here.
Whoever wants to go first.
One of the biggest barriers that we face is that airports themselves are not actually accessible for many people with disability, whether that be from a physical accessibility perspective, so being able to have wide enough spaces for wheelchairs or even being able to bring your wheelchair to the airport sometimes is difficult. The other thing also is that for anyone with any form of non-apparent disability or disability that requires some sensory space, there's no sensory downtime. They are very overwhelming spaces, and being able to travel between each of the different parts is a huge place and way that becomes a barrier. But also it's the attitudes and education of the staff that work at the airports. One of the biggest things that I know I personally face as somebody who has both a physical disability as well as being neurodivergent is that for me, I am definitely always the first person to be stopped or not get help or to be asked to wait or hold, when sometimes that stress of being surrounded by people or having people touch me is so overwhelming that it actually makes flying really, really difficult. The other issue is that they don't really understand that people with disability have an absolute right to be able to travel in a safe and accessible way. And so a lot of the time we're seen as difficult or asked to take additional pathways. So for instance, when I'm a wheelchair user, which I am not a full-time wheelchair user, but when I am, if I have to take that on the plane, I have to go through a full registration process to even get on the plane. And I don't guarantee that at the end, it's not going to be damaged and that it's not going to impair my ability to actually go and do my job at the other end. So that's some of the significant barriers. Is the attitudes, the airplanes themselves are not actually accessible. And it's really hard, especially when you have a non-apparent disability, for people to treat you with the respect that you actually need and understanding that you need.
Yeah, it can be difficult. Like what showing, Megan? Any thoughts, Mitchell?
Yeah, look, I think I tend to find that the thing that really strikes me, and I'm not a
Can you
person,
hear me?
but when I talk to my clients or I talk to people with disability in professional and even in social settings, the thing that really strikes me is that everybody has got a story about flying. It's really universal, and so that's not necessarily. I don't mean to sort of rank those things, just to say that in each case, everyone can say, well, regardless of what my disability is or regardless of what stage of the process, things do crop up. And so, for people who might have sensory impairments of one sort or another, they often say, well, there are these lack of available signage or ways to navigate airports. They're big and complicated places, or information on the planes isn't available in a way I can read and understand. Other people who might have various sort of intellectual or developmental disabilities say, well, these are really overwhelming places and no one sort of set up a space for me to be or a way for me to get the support I need to move through this place without becoming overwhelmed. I think, Megan, you've highlighted the wheelchair accessibility issues, and those are obviously really acute when they crop up. And particularly, some of the stories that I've come across include people being forced to accept kinds of transfers that they are not safe for them or are not dignified. People having to use wheelchairs that the airline or the airport supplies that don't work for them. These things that really go to people's sort of their bodily integrity and their safety in ways that I find quite shocking a lot of the time. I guess another big category that I don't mean to sort of particularly elevate, but one where I think the problems are really stark is for people with assistance animals. There are all kinds of points in the process, checking in, going through the security screening processes, navigating through an airport, where these kinds of issues also crop up of people being refused access in certain ways, of having to fill in these sort of endless reams of paperwork and providing this kind of documentation for something that's really an essential right. And I think my big takeaway from a lot of that is, as I say, that one, that everyone's got a story, but two, that these systems and structures, when they've been developed, they haven't been developed with people with disability. Because if you were asking people with disability what they need, if you're involving them in these design processes, you wouldn't set it up like this. So a lot of these things would just be really either straightforward to fix, or they'd be given the priority that they deserve. And it's just clear that that hasn't happened.
And I think just to add, when it comes to the assistance animals, a lot of the time you can go through the whole process. You can fill every piece of paperwork out, do everything correct, and it can still be up to the person at the gate to decide whether or not you're allowed on that plane. And that, in the end, in itself, being able to put all of that pressure and power when you've done all of the work, and the work is a lot, it shouldn't be, to get to that end point and then have what is a basic requirement refused by somebody who has not inherently been part of the process, in itself is absolutely problematic. And Mitchell talked about people taking on transfers, being able to be physically moved from the aisle seat or their wheelchair to an aisle seat. And one of the issues is that there's a level of physical contact that is inappropriate for many people and can potentially be traumatizing. And so the ability to have consent in these spaces is not always possible. And that is a real concern for a lot of us.
I was gonna ask people with wheelchairs that are electric wheelchairs, are they able to be on there with the electric wheelchairs?
So you can't take the electric wheelchair onto the physical part of the plane. It can be checked, but you have to go through a lot of paperwork and additional processes. And it is not a guarantee that after you book the flight and pay for your flight, that they will allow your electric wheelchair on because of the batteries. And also there are restrictions on how many wheelchairs can go on a single plane as well. Whether or not they're valid, we would probably argue that they are not, and that there are better ways to deal with that. But it really is at the moment up to the airline. And so these new standards could absolutely change that in the best way possible.
See, this is David here. I didn't introduce myself earlier, but I'm visually impaired, and I've gone to overseas with on aeroplane, and they've actually put me in a wheelchair and pushed me. It was much easier than waiting. Like I get service like front line service, just straight in.
This is Mitchell speaking. I guess I would say it's another striking thing I've heard repeatedly from clients and from other people I've spoken to about this, is where they say, this happened to me on an Australian flight or in an Australian airport. And they often have the direct comparison to, and actually last year I went to America or to Europe and I actually had this much better experience. You know, they've got a far better system and set of legal structures, and you're certainly not the first person to say, well, actually, here's another experience I've had overseas that was much, much better and really did give a better sort of consideration to disability access needs.
Cool. Interesting. Thank you very much for sharing, David, Megan, and Mitchell. Building on that, Mitchell, can you share a recent experience you had? We'll move on. So, how did the airport staff handle your needs? Were they well equipped to assist you?
So for me, I am a very regular flyer, and as a person with both physical, psychosocial, and neurodivergent disability, sometimes they are, and it really is airline dependent, but sometimes they are not. And so for me, I had a recent situation where I was having a real struggle being able to use my cane, but at the time I was not bringing my wheelchair with me because I knew it was an added layer that I did not have the mental or physical energy to deal with. And so when it was time to actually go through and book myself in, they offered me a wheelchair, but I'm a larger bodied person and they generally don't have mechanical wheelchairs to be able to move you. And they will generally bring somebody who is not necessarily set up with the strength to push a wheelchair. And the wheelchairs that are available are not great for self-mobility. Like they're not designed for that. And so in that moment, I had to make a decision that I wouldn't use the wheelchair because even though I knew it was going to cause me issues in the long run, because the expectation of having someone push me in a wheelchair that is not mechanical when I am a larger bodied person meant that I couldn't expect that on another person. But then to add into that, once I got to security, once I was there, I needed to hand over my stick, my cane, to be able to be put through the machine. And they were expecting me to be able to walk without it. And when I had to explain to them that I can't even take 2 steps without worrying that I may fall and may have an injury, there was a lot of exasperation and expectation around me. And it was the one time I hadn't worn my non-apparent disabilities lanyard that I'm actually wearing today with me, because I'd left it in my bag for once. Yep. And so when it was time to go through, I had to really show them why they needed to hand me a separate wooden cane to get through. But once I got through, as happens every time I make it through security, I'm up for detection. I am the first person that gets picked every single time to have the detection wand. And I've been talking to many people with disability who use canes, and they are also the first people to have that, as well as those that are wheelchair users. So what's curious to me is, why are we being pulled aside for this? Because it's an additional stress that we then have to stand around for, wait for, and trying to get our bags, reset ourselves is a lot more work. And I did explain to them, I'm in a rush, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I don't have the energy for this. And they're like, no, you have to do it, you don't get a choice. And I get that, but there needs to be some understanding that for sometimes this can be so overwhelming that it meant that I was struggling to speak the next day because of that factor, because I was so overwhelmed from the experience. They weren't trained, they didn't understand. And that is a real concern. That said, once I got onto the plane, they were clearly, the one particular host that had me was amazing. They spoke to me with respect. They helped me where I needed to put my devices, and they explained to me processes and procedures that no one had ever said to me on a plane before. So the diversity of that is not viable. We can't have that lack of continuity. So some are welcome equipped, but not everyone is, and we need consistency.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what we need. But how do we get that across to them?
Well, you get people with disability to run the training. You get us, and you get us to be the ones leading that change. Listen to us, listen to what we know, and bring us to the table, because we can tell you what is needed and how to treat us with the dignity that the UN CRPD states that we have signed on to is the core of what we do.
So very similar to the NDIS.
Absolutely.
They need us to tell them how it should work.
Yeah, and I think I'd also just like to add to that to say that there's a real role for government to make sure that airlines and airports are towing the line on this, to make sure that really they are engaging in these appropriate sort of processes. They are co-designing these systems. They are involving people with disability in their voices. And I think we're probably going to at some point here talk about some of the sort of recent suggestions and initiatives that have been rolled out in that direction. But it really, I guess I would say that airports and airlines have been given a lot of opportunities to do this themselves. They probably haven't taken those opportunities, as we've sort of shown, I think, by the discussion we've been having here today. And that means I think there's a real role for government to step in and say, well, actually, we're going to require you to do your homework, to do this properly, and make sure you actually give the appropriate priority to these sort of human rights principles and the dignity and rights of people with disability.
What about when they do the safety demonstrations and the person that's sitting there can't see it?
Well, and that's a big risk. See, that's the thing, is that the safety demonstration on most Australian airlines relies on a visual component or a visual expectation. I've actually seen some other airlines that are non-Australian airlines that have actually got audio description versions available, but also they just use it as a standard part of the way they just broadcast it to the whole air, like the whole plane. And so those kind of things are very straightforward. Also, even just the little pamphlets they tell you to read, they don't have Braille. And granted, not every person who is blind or visually impaired can read Braille, but there are not other options to engage with that information and material that is not visually expected. That needs to change.
It sure does. And I'm sorry for the challenges that you've gone through, Megan. I think consistency is very important, especially when you're traveling overseas. And also, thank you, Mitchell, for sharing those valuable points. So,
I'm
what
going
legal?
to Mitchell.
Thank you for that, John. Next question. Now, what legal protections exist for travelers with disability in Australia? Uh, Over to you,
Go, Mitchell.
uh,
You will understand
Megan.
this more than I do.
Well, I was going to
Okay,
say,
that's
as
right,
a
Mitchell.
lawyer, this this feels like one I should take first stab at. So, look, I think the major lens through which I would be wanting to think about this is through discrimination law, and particularly given airlines tend to operate sort of a lot of flights are going to go interstate. It's often most helpful to talk about this at a Commonwealth and federal level. So, the Disability Discrimination Act basically says you can't discriminate against people with disability, and that includes where you're providing services like air travel, as airports and airlines are involved in. And so that imposes duties on airports and airlines, legal duties, not to put conditions on passengers that would be hard for people with disability to comply with and aren't reasonable. It means that they need to make reasonable adjustments, which might include providing various forms of assistance and making sure that people are able to use those services on a sort of a reasonable and equal basis. So that's the kind of the framework really that underpins this, and the way that applies to each stage of the process and each different airport and airline does depend on those individual facts to some extent. But the baseline idea is that there is an obligation to take those kinds of reasonable steps to make sure that these services are accessible. Now, there's also something that's made as part of discrimination law in Australia called the Disability Transport Standards. And so those apply to public transportation. So, and that flight is a form of public transportation. And so that says there are certain basic standards that need to be met by forms of public transport to make them accessible to people with disabilities. I guess, though, one major issue with the transport standards as they are right now is that while they do apply to airports and airlines, they haven't really been drafted. It sort of seems when you read through them, you don't see a lot of specific coverage of the really particular features of air travel. So there's an awful lot on there that specify things like train stations and bus stops, and how various seats should be laid out on the bus and that kind of thing. It's very clear that when these were drawn up, people were thinking about what does it look like to take a train or a tram or a bus. But it also there's not the same level of attention being given to what does it look like to go through an airport or to get on a plane, and they don't really cover that aviation context specifically. And so that's, I think, for a long time, something that's been a real gap in the way that these transport standards help to regulate transport and air travel. And so really that meant that we were very pleased at the Justice and Equity Centre earlier this week to see on Monday, when the government released the aviation white paper, they've said they will be rolling out or co-designing a set of standards that will apply to air travel, aviation specifically, which will form a kind of an add-on, a schedule to those disability transport standards. And hopefully those will do a really good job of covering the things that we've been talking about that apply specifically in the aviation context, and making it clear that there is a minimum set of benchmarks that airports and airlines need to be hitting to make sure that their services are accessible.
Wow, interesting.
And I think one of the big things that we absolutely agree with, and the reason that we partnered with JEC on this joint statement, but also on some of the work that we've done around this, is because those legal responsibilities need to be maintained, and those standards need to be something that people know and airlines understand what is expected of them. But also, we think about the fact that in New South Wales, there is a new airport being built right now. Is it being built with accessibility as a first point? Because when you make accessibility your first start, your first moment, rather than an add-on, then you're actually going to make it accessible for everyone. And that's the key that we have to think about. Travel is for everyone. And to have the right to travel means that you should have the right to travel in a safe and clear way that doesn't create damage for you or things that are imperative to your life.
And I'd also add to that, we've talked about the importance of consistency in travel, that it be uniform across airlines and airports around the country. And something I hear consistently from people with disability who travel is, oh, well, whenever I'm traveling, I have to do all of this preparation, all of this research to see, will this airport have this thing for me that I need? Will they have the equipment I need to get on and off the plane? Will they have ways for me to get around? Am I going to need to arrange my own additional supports to get through this sort of process? That's a nightmare. People say it's a huge mental burden, a huge administrative burden that they have to deal with each time they want to fly. And really, there's a need for these sorts of standards on a governmental level to nationally say, whenever you show up at an airport, you should be able to expect at least this, so that you don't have to do all of that legwork yourself. Because the airport and the airline have had to do that, as Megan says, right from the start. They've baked it into the cake when they were coming up with these systems from the outset.
Yeah, no, exactly. Spot on, Megan. To look as an individual, as a traveler. Sorry, David, before you ask the question. Look, I hear a lot of positive stories about traveling, but I hear a lot of challenges as well, and that's kind of kept me away from traveling. So yeah, people like me, they hear these stories. We lack the confidence to travel. But it's something we'll do, but we just need that confidence. Sorry, David, go ahead.
I had a brainstorm idea. I've got a computer background, so I was just thinking maybe we can create a software where people can people can learn about travel, which has got already that in it, like Gran Turismo and all that. You've got the airplanes and all that. Just like a thing that
A simulator.
yeah, simulator that flies and all that, and people with disability going on, and they learn how to treat them.
I love that, David, especially because we know that there are heaps of those airplane simulators where you can physically go in. There are even places you can go to get into a fake cockpit and learn to fly the plane. Could you not also then have a version where you could do it for two things? One, as a person with disability, navigate the experience, but two, as an employee or somebody who is helping or should be working with you to navigate, learn about the experience through AI or a simulation style program. I mean, I love that. And we've got the technology. We just need to do it.
Yeah, I'm thinking that's the way to go. So if you're going to manhandle someone, it's not really manhandling a disabled person. You're learning from a computer.
Yep, I like that.
And you're not really disturbing anyone.
Yeah, Richard, is there any concerns from your end?
Oh, look, lawyers are inherently conservative about technology, I think, a lot of the time. And so AI is something I'm very cautiously dipping toes into myself. But I mean, I've heard suggestions as far as the air travel process in the past where people have said, well, what if we just strap some GoPros to people with disability as they go through that, and you can play that back to an airport or an airline CEO and point out all the things they're doing wrong. This sounds like a way to use technology to get at something pretty similar, but in a way that's even more kind of effective. So I'm all for creative solutions to help improve those processes.
Awesome. Now, thank you, David, for that, and thank you, Mitchell and Megan, for sharing. We'll move on to the next question. Was so I was bring up the next question. Um, we'll go over to you, Megan. So,
Yep.
so, uh, which airports are setting the standard for accessibility, and what can others learn from them?
So, of course, my dogs have decided to start barking. So, if you do hear that in the background, I apologize. But there are definitely some airports overseas that have set the standards for accessibility. I would say in Australia, the most accessible airport that I have seen and heard from others is actually Melbourne Airport. And the reason that it is the most accessible is because what they have done is try to reduce the barriers for people with disability to be able to access every step of the process. There are definitely still some areas that need to work. So, for instance, when you're checking in, it does rely on a screen and that assumes visual engagement. But they have got a couple of portals that are allowing some description or verbal interaction. So you don't just rely on visual requirements. Once you then get to security, one of the things that they have is they don't have a requirement to empty out all your bags and your items. Yes, you still have to empty your pockets as usual, but there is a specific assistance line that most airports have, but this one has a fully dedicated. It's not just kind of feeding you faster into the bigger queue. It's its own spot. And those people are fully trained on how to work with people with disability with dignity. And I know for me, I have had fantastic experiences. I don't need to ask for support. I don't get asked any awkward questions about my physical capability. It's just assumed, you've got a stick, I'll offer you a wooden one. You need to come through, we'll get your bag so no issue happens. They support you, talk you through the process, double check your consent at every point. And once you're through security, they ensure you get through that safely, and then they will help you get to where you need to go if you ask them to, but also they'll double check with you beforehand. So it's not assumed that I have to take the energy to do that. So for me, even the types of scanners they have, the full body scanners, they have two options of types of scanners. That means that for people who can struggle in small spaces, they allow that space because there's nothing over your head. Yes, it still requires standing and holding your arms, but they also have wheelchair appropriate versions as well. And then once you get to the gate, they actually have all the setups, and they are the only airport so far that I have seen that regularly announces that you can have pre-boarding. And it doesn't seem to happen at every other airport, but at Melbourne, I have always heard the offer for pre-boarding has happened every single time. Plus, they have changing places as most of their standard bathrooms with push button, or even their elevators that are only going one level do not require you to press a button. They're actually automated. So the minute you get near them, they prepare for you and bring you in and bring you out. And they also do have a sensory safe space and a place for assistance animals to do their business and be able to have some rest time. They may not seem like big things to a lot of other people, but those things make a huge place. And also they are fully recognizing of the hidden disabilities lanyard or the sunflower pins, and they know what that means. So you do not have to have a physical disability for you to get accessibility immediately.
And the disabled toilets are very big.
They're big. You can actually like move around and get changed and get ready, and they work really well. Plus they have choices of smaller and bigger ones that also say appropriate for hidden disabilities on them.
Awesome. How awesome is that? It's those small things that make a big difference to,
Yeah,
us people.
absolutely. Mitchell, do you know about any other
Mitchell.
airports?
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking there, Megan, I, as a litigation lawyer, I mostly tend to get told about things when they've gone wrong, not when they've gone right, because of course you don't have to call a lawyer to say, I had a great flight today. So I hear less of this, but what I will say is that I often hear about people say, well, actually, this airport has this really good practice, and this airport has this really good practice, and this airline does this thing really well. And it's very hodgepodge and bits and pieces. They'll say, well, actually, at this airport, they do a great job of making sure that you know all your options for scanning at the security screening. And if you've got an assistance animal or something, they're very accommodating to making sure that they're meeting your needs and not putting you through a process that's going to be distressing to you. And then this other airport, they've got great disabled bathrooms, and they've got a really good understanding of how to maybe help someone who might need assistance to use those, but also then leave them with their kind of dignity and privacy. But really, I don't often hear about all those dots getting joined up of those airports sort of putting everything together and learning from one another. It sounds like Melbourne is doing a better job than many, although I would also say I've heard one or two things that Melbourne could do better as well. It really tends to be quite an uneven set of, someone's had a complaint about something and decided it wasn't hard to fix, so they would fix it. But the other airports haven't looked on and gone, oh, we should do that too. So it is really a patchwork quilt when you look at the good practices and the bad ones.
Absolutely agree, Mitchell. And I think the biggest issue is that you can have a great experience at, say, Melbourne Airport, even though I agree it's not perfect. There's still some work that needs to be done. But where you're getting off the plane or where you're flying to doesn't guarantee the same experience. And what that means is that you then have to prepare yourself and do the additional physical and emotional labor to be able to prepare for this. And flying shouldn't require a huge amount of mental preparation to even get to an airport in the first place.
Exactly. Wow. Now, thank you very much for sharing, Megan and Mitchell. Awesome. Some very good points. So, what technological or design innovations could improve the airport experience for people with disability? Over to you, Megan.
Thanks. So, look, from a technological perspective, one of the base things that should happen is that every single interface, because a lot of airports are now moving into self-serve, and a lot of the self-serve aspects mean that it assumes a level of capacity to be able to engage with certain types of interfaces. So just a simple factor, the assumption that you can see a touch screen to know where to press in the first place is not a viable option. And so having the choice to be able to self-serve if you want to should mean that any sort of touch screen also has a separate option with guidance or the ability to verbally manage or move things. So audio description, ensuring that there's sensory recognition so that you know through either touch or some sort of audible aspect that you know what you need to engage with and what you need to do and where you need to go. So having those simple aspects are really important. And that's just using standard accessible technology. But some of the design innovations are offering options that allow for people to go through a sensory safe pathway through an airline or an airport. So when we think about as an adult with sensory needs, absolutely, I'm a little bit better at being able to regulate for years of practice, and I've had lots of tools that I can use. But that is not the case for everyone, or especially children with sensory overwhelm or needs. And so when you're thinking about those things, how do you make it so that somebody can physically get on a plane without having a meltdown, without being in overwhelm. So let's have some separate pathways. Let's allow for people to choose how they get on the plane. And that would be as simple as offering a different pathway if people wanted to use them, or it could be even more engaging by offering quiet spaces on points across the way you're going, so you can have the downtime you need and be able to access them easily without having to ask permission to do so constantly. So those are just some little pieces. There are definitely some others. I'll let Mitchell talk about some, and then I'm happy to add any further.
I was going to ask, have you ever had, Mitchell, mind you, some people are blind, some people are deaf. Sometimes it's hard to communicate with both. So wouldn't it be easier if you ask them verbally and with written, do you have a disability? And they can answer yes or no via machine and to the machine, or if you're gonna be using a program, and if it's a program that gives you things you can type in or whatever.
Yeah, look, I think there's lots of innovations like that could really be sort of applied in ways that sort of smooth out the journey in a lot of the ways that Megan's pointed to. But I suppose my comment would be that a lot of the time, it's not so much about coming up with new innovations as applying the things we already know how to do. So, I mean, to give one kind of example of this, if you look at the way that security screenings operate, it used to be that they all needed to have metal detectors, and that was often a really bad experience for people with sort of prosthetics, for instance, or with various kinds of assistance animals where there's harnesses or whatever that are made out of metal. And so on the one hand, you might say, well, isn't it great that we now have these things called body scanners that you can go through, and the body scanner will be able to generate pictures without having to just go beep, beep, beep at whether there's metal or not. And that should provide a more dignified and appropriate way to go through. The trouble is that you still see stories, even in places where there's body scanners in place, you still see these stories of people who get asked to take off a prosthetic limb, or getting patted down in ways that are really undignified, or being told, oh, sorry, we can't have your assistance dog come through here. Even though those things are technologically doable, even though we have the tech even might be installed at that airport, it's about the way in which the lag in training and in systems that would provide those things hasn't been put into place. So I think the things we're talking about communicating, about enabling better access, we kind of know how to do most of those things already. And I'm not saying that there aren't more ways to think creatively about them and to develop new technologies, but it's mostly a case of applying what we've already got in ways that are really not that hard.
Absolutely agree with you, Mitchell. And I think one of the things that is so clear from this space is that if we don't educate the people on the ground doing the work, relying on systems is going to set up a space where they may not feel they have to actually do anything about it themselves. One of the things that I know that has been looked at as part of some innovation work was this idea of having a disability passport, where you ostensibly provide the information through your passport, and it can be through a chip that gives information directly to people, which is a great idea in concept as long as people use it for the right things, and that it doesn't become a way to create more barriers or more work for people with disability. So as long as we are at the center of designing it so those inherent consequences don't occur, then all of these experiences are absolutely possible. And agreed, Mitchell, innovation isn't about big changes. It's about the little things you can do with what you've already got. And disabled people, we're pretty good at that. Like, bring us in. We're really good at that.
Yes. We totally are. Thank you very much, Megan, for that. And Mitchell, I just heard that there's no more of those machines that go big, big. Is that true?
There's still a lot of airports still use the old metal detectors, but a lot of them have. There's a real mix of technologies. It's one of those things that once you start working on this as a policy issue, you start noticing and sort of taking little mental notes every time you fly, and you really notice that there is no, as we've already talked about in this discussion, a real lack of uniformity across airports, depending on who's upgraded what and who's decided to keep up and who hasn't.
Interesting. Was there anything you wanted to add, Jonathan, David?
No.
One question for Megan. How can people with disabilities and I advocate for better accessibility at airport.
Absolutely. So there's a few ways we can advocate for better accessibility as people with disability. First of all, talk to those that are in charge of making the decisions. Let them know what you need and share your opinions and your experiences. Talk to the transport ministers. Ensure that you share your ideas. Share your ideas with groups like People with Disability and the Justice and Equity Centre, because we have the capacity and the energy to do that work on your behalf, but we need your experiences and knowledge. And you don't always have the time or energy to do it yourself. So share that stuff with us and we can put that information forward for you as well. The other thing to think about is when you are traveling yourself, sometimes you're going to have to advocate for yourself on the ground, in the moment. And one of the best ways to do that is to know what you are allowed to do. And so I know that the Justice and Equity Centre have got a lot of great information. I know I've used it myself that really helps to understand what my rights as a traveller with disability are. And they're in ways that anyone can understand, because I know for me, I am, Mitchell, I'm not a lawyer. I do not speak legalese. But what the Justice and Equity Centre puts out really does help me understand what my rights are. And the stuff that we put out as people with disability helps me understand what my rights are. And knowing that means I feel confident saying, this is what I'm allowed. Please respect my needs as a disabled person to have equity of access, because it's not about equality, because we don't have that yet. It's about having equity of access. And sometimes it's about knowing that you actually have the right to speak up and say, this isn't right. This isn't working for me. I need your help and I need you to respect me as an equitable human being.
A lot of the problem is communication.
Yeah.
Now, if they've communicated to us properly, we can communicate back and tell them, this is what we need. If you can guide us that way, then everything will run smoothly.
Absolutely.
That's right.
But if they don't communicate, and plus in airports, sometimes there's a language barrier.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
thank you, David, for that. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to really, I guess, build on what Megan was saying there too. I think some of the things that we've talked about in the recent white paper and these sort of pretty good policy announcements that we're seeing there, the white paper really, and government in developing it, really drew on stories. They talked pretty heavily about things they'd heard through the Disability Royal Commission about airports. They said, look, this stuff keeps coming up in the newspapers. We keep hearing about these complaints, these experiences that people have. And so I think it has been really important that, and I want to sort of pay tribute to the courage and the persistence of the people that have done this to say this isn't right and to keep speaking out about these sorts of issues. I really do acknowledge the fact that when you're a person who's experienced events like this that can be at least frustrating and sometimes traumatic and harmful, it's not always an easy thing to do to press those rights or to want to talk about it. But I think where people are able to do so, they feel comfortable doing that, and they pursue those sort of avenues either through legal means or through talking to government or to decision makers in companies like airports and airlines. That is where these changes come from. That is what pushes for action. So I think it's really vital to do that sort of thing. I think of my clients when I work on these sorts of cases as partners in pursuing these sort of shared goals. And I'd also highlight that one thing government said around the upcoming aviation and disability standards is that they want to co-design those. So that means that they want to be hearing from what are the priorities of people with disability. They're going to need to know that in order to co-design proper standards. And so that means that, organizations that speak on behalf of people with disability and perhaps government directly really need to hear those stories and keep knowing how things are going wrong at the moment and how they could be made better.
Absolutely agree. And co-design, you all have the ability to be part. As a person with disability, you can be part of that co-design. If you are passionate about this, if you have experiences you want to share, you can be part of the process in different ways, in the ways that are accessible for you. So always know that you can either come to us and get support to do that, or you can directly work with the government. There's lots of different options where co-design is about us ensuring that what we need is going to happen in the way we need it to happen to ensure that we just have the basic human right to travel in a safe and not overwhelming way.
Exactly. Thank you for that, Megan and Mitchell. I think it's very important that we move forward, provide access for everyone. Everyone that deserves safe travel. And I agree. Thank you very much. Back to you, Mitchell. And finally, do you have any practical tips for people with disabilities to prepare for air travel?
Look, I think we've talked about a lot of the things that wind up having to happen at the moment, like doing research on what's available ahead of time, telling people in the airlines and the airports what your needs are and making sure those get met and being prepared to advocate for those. So I think we've had that discussion about, well, that's how things are right now. But I would want to live in a world where we could kind of flip this and say, well, what are the practical tips for airports and airlines to make sure that they've got an accessible service for people with disability? Because I really think while a lot of those things at present do fall to people with disability to make sure that they don't run into these issues, it shouldn't be the responsibility of every single person with disability to educate the staff and to fight for their rights every single time they want to go visit relatives or travel for work or go on a holiday. It really should be something that is the responsibility of the service providers.
Absolutely agree. And if that airline has an access and inclusion plan, and pretty sure every single Australian airline currently has an access and inclusion plan, we need to know how they're putting those things into practice. And we know that there are many airlines with access and inclusion plans that don't even have a process on how to deal with damaging someone's wheelchair. They don't even have a current active process on how to do that is a regular way. Now, ideal world, it wouldn't get damaged in the first place, but we need to be prepared for all potential outcomes. And we know that happens, so have a standardized process that doesn't rely on the person with disability to do all the work. So absolutely agree. It's about how are you as an airline, how are you as an airport ensuring that someone like myself, someone with disability, when they need to fly for work, that they don't have to try and go, okay, well, if I need to be there for one day, I'm going to have to fly a day in advance so that I can get myself in a place where I can do my job. And then I'm going to figure out when I'm going to fly out. And also that means it's extra cost with accommodation. Oh, actually, I might have to have someone come and be my support person for this. And sometimes I have to fly in and fly out to different airports in Australia in one day. And that's not always possible with the way it's set up. From a practical tip for people with disabilities, I will say there are two things that I think can be really, really helpful. One of them is if you are somebody with a non-apparent disability or a hidden disability or an invisible disability, depending on what terminology you use, get yourself a sunflower lanyard. You can get them for free from different places. You don't have to pay for them. Mine, I have updated and added in some extra things, but get yourself one of these lanyards. They do give you the space to be able to ask for the accessibility. Plus, I have an added bonus. I've added on mine some different things that I use. So I've got for me, these are sensory loop tools that help me. I also add on a fidget on mine as well as lip balm because that's something that helps me. And I also just make sure I wear that and then I've got everything I need easy to grab. But also it's something that I can use to help me travel in the best way possible, which means I don't have to get up and down, and it's on my person. Also, I wear dresses. They don't always have pockets. So this is a good way to help from that. The other thing that I would say as well is be prepared with something that's going to make you feel comfortable, but is not overwhelming for you to carry. So whether that is a small piece of warm blanket or a jacket or something that's soft and squishy, bring it with you. There is absolutely no shame in using things publicly that will help you. I will always have, so I'm about to demonstrate, I have lots and lots of different kinds of fidgets. This is I'm obsessed with triceratopses. So this is my favorite triceratops one, but I bring these with me. I have just the head versions of them that I take on planes that help me because I can use the spikes to open cans of drink if I need to, because it's actually got multiple uses. But also it gives me something to use or to engage with when I'm feeling overwhelmed by the travel. And probably the last thing is if you're a walking stick user like me, making sure you get one that can fold and bring one that you don't care if it breaks, because sometimes when they fold, they can break. Don't bring your beautiful ones with you. I wish I could say you should, but yeah, I always try and not use my beautiful ones when I travel.
Yeah, because there's that risk.
Absolutely.
But yeah, now get yourself a fully accessible lanyard, huh? That's awesome. Thank you for sharing, Megan.
No worries.
Awesome. John, David, do you have anything you want to add?
We need to make sure that these standards have practical, tangible outcomes for people with disabilities. And so all stakeholders working collaboration to bring about ease of access.
Absolutely agree, Jonathan. If these standards are fantastic. This is why we're excited about them. And they are going to make a difference if we put them into practice. So let's make sure they're put into practice with people with disability at the centre of them being put into practice.
What's
Yeah,
your
for
thought?
sure. For sure.
What's your thought on? I just got a thought. Just say every person that's got a disability has a paper written down what they need from others and expect from others for them to help them, and where you laminate it and let them read it.
I
If
think that's
they,
part of the thinking behind some of the suggestions that have been made around sort of passenger profiles, which, would be an electronic version of some of the things you're talking about. I think, as Megan said, there's questions you want to have answered about privacy and about the way that those are used. But it is the sort of thing where, as long as it reflects the priorities and the needs of people with disability, there's no reason why airports and airlines couldn't do something like that and make sure that they know these things in advance, that you don't need to keep repeating yourself every time, and they can make the necessary arrangements.
all right, if you got someone with a vision impairment, they have checkpoints. Do this, that. Or person with this, do that. I've got a list.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly right. Some of these standards will allow for that if they're implemented in a disability affirming way.
Well, thank you for
Cool,
coming. And if you,
No, thank you, David. Thank you. Yep. No, all good. Yeah, thank you, David, for asking the questions. Thank you, John, as well. But most importantly, thank you, Mitchell and Megan, for allowing us to interview you and getting us to pick your brains on improving our understanding of accessibility when it comes to airports. I think for everyone, we all deserve, safe and enjoyable travel. But in doing so, we are faced with challenges along the way. So thank you for sharing, Megan and Mitchell. It's always a pleasure having you on the podcast. And it's always good to, come back for more, keep us updated.
Anytime, Ibby. Thank you, Ibby, David, and Jonathan. Greatly appreciate it, and awesome to be doing this with you, Mitchell. Thank you.
Feelings mutual, Megan, and my thanks to everyone. And hopefully next time we come on, we've got even more good policy news.
Yes, be awesome.
I hope so. For the viewers out there, thank you for watching CripChat. You're your podcast on everything disability.
Please like and share.
As we talk about more things in the Good morning.